The air in Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory. 1876 was not merely hot, it was sharp, carrying fine grit that tasted of rust and alkali. It coated the tongue and settled on everything: the bristly leaves of the yucca plants, the low, gray-green mesquite, and the newly laid steel of the Atchison. Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad line slicing straight through the ancient scrubland. Nora Quinn stepped down from the boxcar, gripping a worn carpet bag and a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle that held her sewing machine. She was 25, and the dust immediately claimed the hem of her plain woolen traveling skirt, turning it the uniform red of the territory. Her face, framed by the bonnet she'd cinched tight against the wind, was practical and kind. Her pale eyes, accustomed to measuring thread and calculating the distance between Missouri and a promised future, scanned the makeshift platform. Santa Rosa was less a town and more a cluster of necessity. A station house, a blacksmith shop smelling richly of coke and hot iron, a long, low general store with an awning, and a scattering of adobe homes baked into the landscape. The promise of the railroad and the nearby silver mines had dragged this outpost into being, but the lifeblood was the Pecos River, currently a sluggish, precious vein of green running past the edge of the settlement. Nora had traveled for 3 weeks, sustained by the single sheet of legal paper in her satchel, a binding promise of marriage, signed by Thomas Avery, owner of a small but well-watered homestead on the Pecos. She was a seamstress and a former schoolteacher, orphaned young after losing her mother to swamp fever. What she craved was not romance, but permanence, a true home, solid walls, and the quiet dignity of belonging. A boy, maybe 13, with a mop of tow-colored hair and an earnest concentration that made him look older, was distributing papers near the depot. This must be Jesse Pike, the newsboy. "Excuse me, son," Nora said, her voice dry from the travel, but steady. "Can you direct me to the Avery homestead? I am Nora Quinn." Jesse Pike stopped, his eyes wide and sympathetic. He didn't reach for a coin. He merely pointed to a small gathering near the edge of the cemetery, where a mound of freshly turned earth lay raw against the sun-baked ground. "Mr. Avery's burial just finished, ma'am," Jesse whispered, pulling his cap low. "The preacher is still saying his final words." The news hit Nora with the quiet finality of a dropped stone. No dramatics, no tears, just the cold reality that her 3-week journey, her contract, and her future were now nothing more than a fresh grave under the relentless New Mexico sky. The simple, honest emotion that gripped her wasn't grief for a man she barely knew through correspondence, but the profound, weary disappointment of having to start over. Again, she watched the small gathering disperse a stout woman in a black dress, a tall, authoritative man on horseback, and a man with a clerical collar. The man on horseback, Silas Brand, did not look sad. He looked proprietary. Silas Brand, in his 50s, was the cattle baron of the valley, a man whose word carried more weight than the scant federal law. He had cornered the market on water rights, controlling the main well and irrigation ditches along the Pecos. His nephew, Sheriff Wade Mercer, a bulky man in his 30s with a perpetually suspicious frown, rode slightly behind him, serving as Brand's shadow and instrument. Brand wanted the Avery land, a crucial strip along the river that sat perfectly positioned to control the approaches to the new rail depot and the silver mine freight line. Brand rode over to Nora, his gaze running over her luggage with a dismissing calculation. "You, the woman from Missouri, Miss Quinn." His voice was smooth, like river stones that had worn away everything genuine. "I am." Nora held her chin steady. Brand chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Well, Thomas won't be needing a wife now. Died in his well, the fool. Now, if you've got any claim on his property, you should talk to my nephew, Sheriff Mercer. I hold the note for the water fees, and that property is now under immediate lien." The paper in her satchel, the lawful promise, suddenly felt like a joke. She had arrived not to be a bride, but an executor of a debt she hadn't incurred. "I understand," Nora said, the practical instinct kicking in. I will examine my papers and speak with the judge. Brand's smile vanished. Judge Doyle can't help you, girl. Thomas Avery owed money and water. The land goes to whoever pays the dues. And nobody's stepping up to pay my dues. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Seeking weakness, I'll give you a ride back to the station. If you catch the outbound train tonight, I'll even buy your ticket. Thank you for the offer. Mr. Brand, Nora replied, her voice polite but firm. But I'll stay for a few days. I have work here, and the town needs a seamstress. Brand grunted, turning his horse sharply. The implication was clear. You're fighting a current you can't swim against. Left alone near the cemetery, Nora finally lifted the heavy canvas bundle, balancing it atop the carpet bag. She walked not toward the station, but toward the general store, Rosa Alvarez's establishment, which also housed the post office and functioned as the town's social heart. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, kerosene, and unwashed wool. Rosa Alvarez, a robust Mexican woman with kind, weary eyes, was weighing flour. She nodded sympathetically. Rosa was the town's midwife, shopkeeper, and unofficial collector of all news and woes. Nora laid her machine down carefully. Rosa Alvarez. The same, Rosa said, pushing a coil of rope aside. Welcome to Santa Rosa, Miss Quinn. I wish it were under happier circumstances. Thank you. I have a contract here. I need to find the judge. And I need a place to set up my sewing machine for a few days to earn passage home, or a reason to stay. The judge is Maeve Doyle, a widow woman, and she's a fair hand, Rosa explained. She's at the courthouse, next to the saloon, but Miss Quinn, Brand has the water and the sheriff. He runs the valley. I'm running a sewing machine. That's a different kind of engine, Nora murmured, more to herself than to Rosa. She paid for a cup of lukewarm coffee and a stale biscuit, a tangible cost of life here. The price of flour was already a shock. Later that afternoon, Nora found herself at the courthouse, a structure slightly more substantial than the others. Judge Maeve Doyle, a woman in her late 40s, sat behind a sturdy oak desk, her features sharp and intelligent. Judge Doyle looked over the marriage contract, a simple, formal promise to bind Thomas Avery and Nora Quinn upon her arrival. It's sound, Miss Quinn, as far as intent goes, the judge said, tapping the document. But without the marriage, you have no immediate standing as an heir. Avery died intestate. Brand is already claiming the land for water debt. Did Mr. Avery have any immediate family? None. He was a solitary man, but he had a strong belief in water rights being tied to the land, not to the person holding the biggest wallet, a principle Brand hates. Judge Doyle leaned forward. You have no claim, but you have possession. What did Avery send you that was personal, anything valuable? Only the documents and a few letters, Nora said. She pulled a small iron key from her skirt pocket. This was in his last letter. It opens a small trunk he said contained his life's legacy. It's still at the homestead. Retrieve it and hold on to whatever is inside, the judge advised. Possession is 9/10 of the law in the New Mexico territory. Brand will move fast to seize that property. As Nora left the courthouse, the setting sun cast long, dusty shadows. The town's social atmosphere was palpable thin law and fast-moving rumors. There were the railroad men, often Irish and black freedmen, viewed with suspicion by the established Mexicano and older American ranching families, creating a light, realistic cultural friction. Everyone was on edge, dependent on the new rail line, but wary of the shifting power it brought. She needed to go to the Avery homestead, and she needed transport. Across the street, the blacksmith shop was still active. A man stood silhouetted against the intense glow of the forge, his arm rising and falling rhythmically, striking hot iron on the anvil. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was steady, reliable, a counterpoint to the town's nervous silence. This was Eli Cutter, 32, the former Civil War corporal who had traded the violence of the cannon for the discipline of the hammer. He was rugged, quiet to the point of being famously difficult, and had scars that spoke of more than just a life of hard labor. A visible scar tracked across his broad shoulder, often hidden by the sweat and grime of his work. He was currently employed making new track spikes and repair tools for the railroad, a necessity that Brand resented, as it gave Eli an inconvenient autonomy. Nora approached the open doorway. The heat radiating off the forge was almost a physical presence. "Mr. Cutter." Eli stopped, the hammer mid-swing. His eyes, the color of clean steel, turned to her calm, assessing, revealing nothing of his thoughts. The sudden silence, broken only by the hiss of the cooling trough, felt vast. "The name is Eli," he corrected simply, wiping a bead of sweat with the back of a hand the size of a shovel. "I am Nora Quinn. I need to get out to the Avery homestead before dark. I hear you have the only functioning wagon aside from Brand's freight line." Eli leaned the hammer against the anvil. It was a massive, perfectly balanced tool, an extension of the man himself, a symbol of disciplined labor and honest output. "It'll cost you $1. Ma'am, I don't run a livery." Nora opened her purse, pulled out a silver dollar, and placed it on the wooden block by the door. "Then consider it a fare. Can you take me now?" Eli looked at the dollar, then at Nora's uncompromising expression. He sensed no neediness in her, only resolve. He nodded. "Wait here. It'll take me a minute to wash up." The ride was bone-jarringly quiet. The homestead was a small, dusty place nestled near a bend in the Pecos, distinguished mainly by its deep, stone-lined well and the faint, fertile smell of river water fighting the dry air. As Eli unhitched the horse, Nora went inside the small adobe cabin. It was spare, clean, and contained the small iron trunk exactly where Avery's last letter had described it. Nora fumbled with the key, and the lock clicked open. Inside, beneath a few sentimental items, lay not gold, but two things of profound, unexpected value. First, a small, tightly rolled sheet of oilskin, a hand-drawn map detailing the various irrigation ditches, water conduits, and most crucially, the underground feeder lines that serviced the Avery property, tracing the true path of the water before it reached Brand's main channels. Second, a neatly bound ledger listing Thomas Avery's water payments, noting every dispute with Brand over the past 3 years. As Nora tucked the oilskin map securely into her sewing kit, she noticed something odd in the ledger. The last entry, dated 2 days before his death, showed a massive, unexplained payment to Brand, a desperate attempt to clear the debt. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear Eli return until he cleared his throat from the doorway. "The homestead is still sound. Miss Quinn," he said, his eyes scanning the property. "Not her. The well looks recently cleaned, which is odd. Not what a sick man does." "Mr. Avery wasn't sick," Nora said, closing the trunk with a decisive snap. "He drowned in the well. The burial just finished." Eli's calm eyes held hers for a long moment. "A man who dies in his own well usually falls in. A fall in a clean, stone-lined well leaves marks. I saw the sheriff there earlier. Wade Mercer." "Brand's nephew," Nora supplied. They were quick to fill the hole. Eli paused, then added a cryptic remark that stuck in Nora's mind. "Hard to find truth in the dirt when the ground's been patted down too soon." They drove back in the deepening twilight. The train station was still busy. The air was colder now, heavy with the metallic scent of engine oil and the distant, lonely wail of the locomotive whistle. "Thank you, Mr. Eli," Nora said, paying him a second, unsolicited dollar. "You didn't just drive me. You were observant." "You paid for a service, ma'am." Nora studied him. His taciturn nature was indeed difficult, but his observation about the well showed a clear, quiet integrity. He always did the right thing, even if he rarely spoke about it. She recognized the look in his eye, the weariness of a man who has seen enough chaos to value silence above all else. She had secured a small, dusty room above Rosa's general store after settling her few belongings. Nora went back to the street to buy a lantern. She saw Eli again, sitting alone on a water trough near his smithy, polishing the massive hammer. The tool, polished to a dark sheen, was almost a living thing in his hands, a symbol of his power and his choice for hard, honest work. "What will you do now?" Miss Quinn Eli asked, without looking up. "I'll stay. I have a contract to fulfill. Even if the groom is gone, I need a place to teach and a way to earn a living. The Avery land is perfect for a small school and a sewing shop." She looked towards the well-worn leather pouch containing her sewing instruments, her small, mobile symbol of order, persistence, and healing through creation. "I came here for a home. Mr. Eli, I don't intend to leave just because it's been delayed by a funeral." Eli finally looked up, a small, wry curve at the corner of his mouth. "The Avery land has no water rights now? Brand claimed them, and he won't let you keep the stream. You might have a place to teach, but you won't have the students or the water to keep the door open." "Then I'll find the water," Nora said simply. She touched the oilskin map through the fabric of her skirt. The water jug on Brand's side of the street, always full and shining, had already become a powerful symbol of his control. "Water is power, Miss Quinn," Eli warned her. "And a map is a guide," Nora countered, giving him a polite nod before turning toward the warm glow of Rosa's store. She hadn't realized that the moment she walked away, the very tool of her survival, the map had become the key that would unleash the conflict. Brand, having heard of her visit to the Avery cabin, was already moving to seize the property, his claim backed by the tacit authority of his nephew. Sheriff Mercer, Nora, the sensible, practical woman seeking quiet domesticity, had, without meaning to, just declared war on the most powerful man in the New Mexico territory. The air that afternoon was hotter than usual. A cruel midday sun beating down on the dusty square near the railroad tracks. The usual rhythm of the town, the lowing of cattle. The grinding of the train depot's gears was replaced by a tense, ugly silence. Sheriff Wade Mercer had set up an impromptu sidewalk court outside Eli Cutter's blacksmith shop. It wasn't an official proceeding. It was an intimidation display, designed to be witnessed by the railroad workers collecting their wages and the local townspeople. Mercer, looking large and menacing in his dusty uniform, stood beside a pile of brand-new iron rail spikes and ties. Eli Cutter stood calmly a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his shirt dark with sweat. He was not restrained, but the 3 deputies standing nearby made it clear he wasn't free. "Mr. Cutter," Mercer drawled, his voice loud enough to carry, "We found these stolen railroad supplies. Property of the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad, in a ditch just behind your shop. That is theft of government and private property, a serious charge." Eli's eyes, usually so steady, were cold with controlled anger. "I didn't take them. Mercer, that ain't what the evidence says. Eli, the evidence says you were skimming materials off the job, maybe to sell to those backwoods prospectors or use in your own illegal works." Mercer gestured to the crowd, playing to the prejudice against the rail workers, many of whom were seen as transient and unreliable. "We can't have the men who build the line stealing the very goods we need to keep the line safe." Silas Brand stood just off to the side, leaning against his horse, the picture of a concerned, benevolent citizen. He wasn't saying a word, but his presence was the true force of the accusation. This wasn't about spikes. It was about crushing Eli's independence and proving Brand's absolute control over every working man in Santa Rosa. "Mercer picked up a heavy rail spike. The punishment for this sort of theft starts with 20 lashes. Mr. Cutter, followed by a month in the lockup. Unless, of course, someone wants to speak to your character." It was Nora Quinn who unexpectedly stepped out from the shadow of the general store. She had been on her way to the Avery homestead, intending to start clearing the well. Her sensible traveling dress and bonnet made her look completely out of place in the charged atmosphere, like a gentle moth among hungry vultures. Nora walked directly up to the sheriff. "Sheriff Mercer, may I examine the evidence?" Mercer blinked, momentarily thrown by her calm confidence. "What business is this of yours?" Miss Quinn, if you are accusing a man of theft based on the tools of his trade, I believe it is everyone's business, she replied, extending a hand. Mercer reluctantly handed her the spike. It was a heavy, precisely shaped piece of iron. Nora didn't look at the point or the shaft, but at the flat, smooth head of the spike. The rail crew often used different blacksmiths, but Eli was the best and had the contract for specialized, high-stress components. Nora had seen him at his forge the day before, shaping these very objects. She ran her thumb across the metal, feeling the distinct, subtle depressions on the iron. She held the spike up, positioning it so the sun hit the head directly. "Sheriff," Nora stated, her voice quiet but carrying clearly over the crowd, "Mr. Cutter did not steal these spikes. He made them." Mercer scoffed. "All spikes look the same, ma'am." "They do not," Nora countered, pointing to a barely visible, meticulously forged indentation near the edge of the head. "Mr. Cutter signs his work on all high-grade metalwork, particularly those meant for the rail where failure means disaster. He includes a personal mark, a very specific, tiny character, visible only upon close inspection. I believe you'll find the initials E.C. on this spike." A murmur went through the crowd. Eli Cutter, renowned for his taciturn nature, was equally renowned for his craftsmanship. It was true. His work was always distinguishable by its quality and sometimes by a subtle, private mark. Mercer snatched the spike back, frowning as he tried to find the mark. Silas Brand pushed off his horse and approached Nora, his face split between irritation and a calculated smile. "Miss Quinn, a clever observation. You seem quite invested in the fate of this roughneck." Brand smoothly slid into the conversation, turning the public spectacle into a private negotiation. Perhaps Mr. Cutter was careless, not dishonest. We can overlook this misunderstanding, a small matter of misplaced spikes, if you, a respectable woman, would do the respectable thing. "And what is that?" Mr. Brand, Nora asked, refusing to lower her voice. "That old Avery land is nothing but a headache. The taxes, the water debt. You're alone. Why don't you sign the property rights over to me right now, and I'll cancel the entire debt, give you $1,000 for your trouble, and even tell Mercer here to let Eli walk free. No questions asked." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I'll make sure you get a ticket to any place you want, Texas, California, even back to Missouri." He was offering a trade Eli's freedom for the Avery land and the hidden map within it. Nora looked past Brand to Eli, who had not moved, but whose posture showed a deep, visceral refusal of the offer. Eli would rather take the whipping than be bought out of a lie. Nora turned back to Brand. "Mr. Brand, you are offering to forgive a debt I did not incur in exchange for land I own, provided I drop a claim and ignore a blatant piece of evidence that clears an innocent man. That is not an act of grace. That is extortion." Her voice was calm and measured, a teacher addressing a student who had cheated on an exam. She wasn't begging for Eli, she was defending the truth. "The mark proves he made the spike, not that he stole it. And if someone framed him using his own marked materials, it implies a setup involving someone who knows his work and who has access to the railroad's inventory." She then looked directly at Sheriff Mercer. "And I do not bargain with the law. I demand the law be upheld, release Mr. Cutter, or charge him based on legitimate evidence, not on planted goods." The crowd was fully engaged now. Nora had saved Eli not through tears or feminine pleading, but through practical logic and undeniable fact. Brand's jaw tightened. He had miscalculated her. He had expected a weary traveler to fold under pressure. Instead, he found a stubborn, plain-spoken opponent. Mercer, frustrated and embarrassed, stammered. "The charge stands. We'll hold him for further investigation." "On what grounds?" Sheriff Eli's voice was suddenly deep and resonant. "On the grounds that I make better spikes than anyone else." Brand raised a hand to silence his nephew. He looked at Nora, his eyes calculating how quickly he could destroy her new base of operations. Fine, Brand spat. You want the Avery land, you want to play legally, very well. Effective immediately. I'm declaring a water limitation order on the Avery property. You have 10 days. Miss Quinn, to establish legal ownership, pay all outstanding water fees, and prove your claim is not frivolous. If you fail, the water rights are mine, and the land will be seized. He knew she couldn't come up with the money or the legal paperwork that fast. He was giving her 10 days to dry up and blow away. Brand and Mercer rode off, leaving the square simmering with resentment and gossip. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eli walked over to her, his expression unreadable. He had been released, but he knew the battle had just begun. He picked up his hammer, hefted it, and placed it back on the anvil. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low and flat. "Yes, I did," Nora replied, dusting her hands off briskly. "I came to this territory looking for honesty. I found a great deal of dishonesty. And one clear, small instance of integrity. I side with integrity." Later that evening, the tension of the day spilled over at the saloon. A few of Brand's hired hands got drunk and started causing trouble, throwing bottles and shouting insults at the railroad workers and at Nora, calling her a carpetbagging water thief. And worse. Eli found Nora at the back of Rosa's store, checking the latches. "Come with me," he ordered, taking her arm without asking permission. Nora resisted, pulling back slightly. "I'm not running from a few drunks. Mr. Eli, you're avoiding trouble so you can fight the real battle tomorrow. Leave the scuffling to the scoundrels," he insisted, guiding her quickly down a side alley toward the quieter shadows near his shop. His touch was firm, not gentle, a practical act of defense. As they passed Rosa's store, they heard a loud splintering sound, Brand's men trying to break the back door hinge. Eli stopped. "Stay here." He grabbed a piece of scrap iron from his yard, walked back to the door, and with silent, swift movements, fixed the broken hinge, hammering the metal back into place and bracing the frame with a sturdy, temporary bar. The men, hearing the sudden authoritative clang of Eli's work and seeing his shadow, scattered into the night, preferring a soft target to a known fighter. He returned to Nora, tossing the scrap iron aside. "It will hold until morning." That was a clumsy way to thank a woman. "Mr. Eli," Nora said, trying to lighten the moment. "I don't know any graceful ways," Eli admitted, looking away. "I know how to fix things that are broken and how to make things that hold together." This rough, sincere thank you was more genuine than any flowery speech. Nora knew he meant it. "I still need to secure the Avery property," Nora stated. Returning to the pragmatic matter at hand, "I need to use this 10 days to establish residency, find Avery's legal receipts, and prepare to defend the land. The well needs repairing, the roof needs fixing, and I need a strong porch to set up my teaching space. I cannot do that alone." She met his gaze directly. "I am offering you a business arrangement. Mr. Eli, I will pay you $2 a day, which I will earn by sewing through the night, plus 2 square meals. If you will work for me for 1 week, repair the well, secure the buildings, and help me with the initial legal filings. It's honest pay for honest work." Eli considered it. He hated working for others. But this wasn't Brand. This was a direct, fair trade for labor. And she was fighting the good fight. He knew the Avery property was worth defending. Its water rights were crucial to breaking Brand's chokehold. 5 days, Eli countered. Looking at the time, I can shore up the well, build the porch, and fix the fences in 5 days. $3 a day. And the meals? Agreed. Agreed, Nora said, shaking his hand. His palm was rough and calloused, the skin worn smooth in some places and thick with strength in others. The touch was brief, businesslike, yet surprisingly grounding. Just as they were turning to leave, Jesse Pike, the newsboy, ran up breathlessly, a small lamp illuminating his face. "Miss Quinn, Mr. Eli," he gasped, having clearly run the entire way from the Avery homestead. "I was doing my route today, delivering papers, and I stopped by the well at Mr. Avery's place. I found something." Jesse opened his hand, revealing a half-buried heel of a boot, detached from the leather, with 3 oddly spaced triangular metal studs driven into the heel, a distinct, custom pattern. This was caught in the mud near the lip of the well. Jesse explained, right where the stone crumbled a bit. I saw folks wrestling like that one time, near the water trough. Mr. Avery wasn't sick. Miss Quinn, he was fighting. Someone shoved him. Nora stared at the custom heel. Eli's eyes narrowed. That is a specific pattern of heel studding, Eli said, his voice dangerously low. A bootmaker in Albuquerque does that. He only does it for the Brand Ranch hands. They call it the crow's foot mark. The inciting incident was complete. The simple act of claiming land had escalated to a fight for truth. And now, the stakes were murder. Thomas Avery had not died of a simple fall. He had been pushed, and the evidence now sat in Nora Quinn's hand, putting her, and anyone who helped her, squarely in Brand's crosshairs. The 5-day contract had just become a matter of survival. The 10-day countdown imposed by Silas Brand started with the low hum of honest labor. Nora set up her sewing machine, the heavy singer a symbol of her resilience, in the small, unused front room of the Avery cabin. Outside, the scent of hot iron and burning coke replaced the dust of her travel. Eli Cutter was making good on his 5-day contract, not just fixing things, but making them sturdy. Nora settled into the routine of working for others in Santa Rosa. She mended torn trousers for the railroad hands, patched worn canvas for the local teamsters, and started work on a small, urgent wedding dress for a young Mexican bride. She worked mostly in the early mornings and late evenings, dedicating the harsh midday to the Avery property. Eli, meanwhile, was focused and quiet. He spent his morning at the rail yard forge, pounding out heavy horseshoes and repair clamps for the mine equipment. By afternoon, he was at the Avery place. The rhythm of his hammer on the split wood and dented tin of the roof was as steady and hypnotic as the bellows at his shop. He fixed the rotting fence posts with salvaged timber, ensuring the line of demarcation was clear and unapologetic. Their days developed a simple, shared synchronicity. Nora would be washing clothes at the small creek, the precious water bubbling past, while Eli was nearby, cleaning out the well, hauling up bucket after bucket of sludge and grit to get to the clear source. The practical necessity of working side by side forged a connection that bypassed idle conversation. One evening, after Eli had spent hours relining the well's stonework, he came into the cabin, wiping his hands on a rough rag. "Roof is sealed tight," he announced, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Porch frame is up. The well will hold." Nora was bent over her machine, finishing the hem of a man's coat. "Supper is ready. Mr. Eli." He sat at the small table, and Nora set down a plate. She hadn't been to Rosa's to buy flour and sugar, so she had made a batch of cornbread and boiled beans. The cornbread, sadly, was scorched around the edges. "I'm afraid I charged you too much for the meal," Nora said, half apologetically, half jokingly. "The oven's temperamental." Eli picked up a piece, the charred crust flaking slightly, and took a large bite. He chewed slowly, his expression unchanging. "It's good," he finally stated. "It's burnt," Nora corrected. Eli took another bite, swallowing deliberately. "Burnt is flavorful. It's what you remember." Nora stared at him, then burst into a genuine, unburdened laugh. It was a clear sound, rare in the dusty air. "Burnt is flavorful," she repeated, wiping a tear of laughter from her eye. "That is the most absurd, honest piece of culinary critique I have ever heard, Mr. Eli." "It's true," he insisted, without a trace of humor, which only made Nora smile wider. The tiny, unexpected exchange cut through the tension of their situation and their work. It was deadpan humor, a shared moment of wit hidden beneath a rock-solid exterior. As the days passed, Nora kept her focus on the legal front. She rode into town, consulting with her 2 unexpected allies. Judge Maeve Doyle reviewed the documents Nora possessed the original marriage contract. Thomas Avery's water payment ledgers, which showed Brand often delayed cashing checks until the last minute, and the mysterious oilskin map of the hidden water lines. The contract won't hold up in court for ownership. Miss Quinn, Judge Doyle advised, tapping the documents. But it proves your intent to reside here and your strong relationship with the deceased. We can use that intent, combined with these payment receipts, to file for temporary administrative control of the property. It buys us time against Mercer's 10-day ultimatum. Meanwhile, Rosa Alvarez, with her deep connections in the community, gave Nora moral and social guidance. Silas Brand feeds on fear. Mia, don't let him make you small. If you keep the law and the church on your side, he cannot simply ride you out. Rosa helped Nora draft a petition to the territorial office, asking for a fair review of Brand's water usage, a direct, legal challenge to his power. The partnership with Eli continued to reveal their inner worlds, not through long speeches, but through tiny details of shared hardship. Nora often wore long sleeves, even in the increasing heat. One afternoon, while sitting on the newly constructed porch, she was diligently working on a complicated embroidery for a client. She had pushed her sleeve up, revealing a small area of discolored, slightly puckered skin on her wrist, an old burn from a childhood accident with an iron. She quickly pulled the sleeve back down, glancing self-consciously at Eli, who was hammering posts nearby. Later, she spoke quietly to Rosa. "I'm not beautiful. Rosa, I know that. I'm plain and scarred and practical. I just need to be a respectable woman to get by." Rosa simply squeezed her hand. "Beauty, Nora, is the kind of fire you carry inside, not the smooth surface of the skin, and your practicality, Mija, that is the most beautiful thing in this desert." Eli, for his part, struggled with a different kind of scar. Several times. Nora woke in the dark hours to the sound of soft, rhythmic movement in the yard. It wasn't the sound of his hammer, but the sound of his body walking, chopping wood, or simply sitting perfectly still. She knew he suffered from night terrors, a lingering shadow from the artillery fire of the war, though he never spoke of it. The only time he seemed truly at peace, truly grounded, was when he was at the forge, his arm moving with the repetitive, familiar violence of controlled labor. The opposition from Brand was subtle but constant. One day, a water wagon hired by Nora to fill her cistern was turned away from the main town well. Another time, Brand's drovers deliberately let a small herd of cattle wander onto the unfenced edge of Avery's land, trampling the small row of corn Nora had just managed to plant. "They do that to make you feel helpless," Eli observed, fixing the trampled fence line. "I won't feel helpless," Nora declared, picking up the mangled corn stalks. "I'll plant something they can't trample." The most terrifying challenge, however, came from the landscape itself. The 5th day of their contract, a massive, unpredicted dust storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned a deep, churning orange-red. The wind screamed like a banshee through the canyons. "Get the windows shut, cover your machine," Eli shouted, rushing toward the newly erected porch roof. Nora grabbed blankets and thick canvas, covering her precious singer. Eli fought the wind, tying down the sheets of tin he'd just nailed to the roof frame, battling to keep the house intact. The air became thick, blinding. When the storm reached its peak fury, they retreated inside. Eli braced the main door with a heavy beam. They stood shoulder to shoulder, leaning against the sturdy wood, listening to the house rattle and groan, the very land trying to tear their small sanctuary apart. They didn't speak. The sheer noise of the storm made conversation impossible. But in the close, dark space, leaning into the door's resistance, a new understanding settled between them. They were relying completely on Eli's craftsmanship and Nora's tenacity to survive the fury. They were a unified front. The storm, the nature of this harsh land, had tested them and, in doing so, had forced them to trust each other more completely than any conversation could have achieved. When the storm finally began to abate, the world was blanketed in a heavy layer of red dust. "That was a good roof, Mr. Eli," Nora said simply. "It holds," he replied. That night, as Nora cleared the gritty table, she felt her determination harden. She was not only fighting for the Avery land for herself, she was fighting for the memory of the man who had promised her a home, and she was fighting for the justice due to him. She knew the crow's foot heel mark was not just evidence of a scuffle, it was evidence of murder by Brand's men. "I must pursue this. Eli," she said, using his first name for the first time. Even if Thomas Avery and I never became husband and wife, he was a decent man trying to stand up to a bully. Finding justice for his past is the only honorable way to walk into my future here. The next day, as Eli was mending the sleeve of his heavy work shirt, a tear caused by a flying branch during the storm, Nora took her needle and thread. "Let me do that," she said. Eli stood still while Nora worked, the needle flashing in the lamplight. She had to stand close, her hands brushing his rough forearm as she cinched the stitch. The proximity was startling. Her breath was warm against his neck, the scent of lavender from her sewing pouch replacing the usual smell of dust and iron. Their bodies were inches apart, separated only by the thread and the rough canvas of his shirt. This was not a flirtation. It was an intimacy born of necessity and shared danger. Eli felt the steady, gentle pressure of her finger as she pushed the needle through the cloth, and his heartbeat hitched a silent, powerful moment of connection. The practical seamstress and the quiet blacksmith, linked not by a kiss, but by a simple, necessary mend. The simple seed of affection, unadorned and true, had been planted beneath the harsh dust of Santa Rosa. The Avery homestead, despite Eli's robust repairs, was under siege by silence. The 10-day window was rapidly closing. Nora had successfully filed for temporary administrative control, but she knew Brand would not respect paperwork. To understand how Brand was stealing the water, they had to understand the earth itself. That evening, as a sliver of moon hung over the Pecos, Eli and Nora embarked on a nocturnal investigation. They walked the quiet darkness along the main railroad track, the route Eli knew intimately as a former switchman and current supplier. "The main pumping station feeds Brand's reservoir first," Eli murmured, his voice low against the constant shh of the desert wind. "But Avery's land sits on a low rise, fed by a feeder channel from the river itself, a small stream that Brand diverted years ago. That map you have, it shows what happens to the stream before it hits Brand's ditch." They cut away from the track and followed the faint, dried-up course of the old stream, using a single shielded lantern about a mile from town, near an unused auxiliary water depot for the earliest rail teams. Eli stopped. "Look here," he whispered. Hidden beneath a thicket of scrub oak was a heavy, iron pipe running deep into the ground. It was clearly a secondary, illicit line. Eli used a specialized wrench he carried in his belt, a tool designed for breaking railway nuts, and forced the access cap open. Inside, they could hear the faint, steady sound of water running, an unseen stream flowing toward the Brand ranch. "He's using the old rail depot's infrastructure," Nora realized. Eli ran his fingers over the pipe's valve mechanism. The cap was made of thick, forged cast iron. On the surface, where a manufacturer's mark should have been, there was an area that had been violently scoured and filed down. "He didn't just divert it," Eli said, his voice flat with recognition. "He had to bend the main line to this new direction. That requires a specialty tool, a valve key, and he didn't want the key traced." Eli brought the lantern closer. Despite the erasure, he could feel a familiar depression. "The original key and valve cap were mine. I forged a batch for the rail gang 2 years ago. Every one of them carried my marquee on the underside of the handle and the face of the cap. Someone used my work to steal the water, and then tried to erase the proof." The implication hit Nora instantly. This wasn't just about water theft. It was a deliberate, continuous effort to frame Eli Cutter. They used his marked materials to steal the Avery water, making it appear that Eli was a rogue operative, selling the rail materials for private use. This connected the current rail spike setup to the murder of Avery. using Eli's own tools to cover the crime. They wanted to pin the water theft on you, Mr. Eli. So when I arrived and started asking questions, they could discredit you as a witness, Nora concluded, her mind working furiously. Eli simply replaced the cap and covered the pipe with the scrub. The question is, who had the key long enough to file it down without being noticed? The answer came violently the next morning. Sheriff Mercer, flanked by 2 deputies, arrived at Eli's smithy with a warrant. "We're conducting a thorough investigation of the theft of railroad materials." "Cutter," Mercer announced, his eyes shining with false authority. "And we have reason to believe you've secreted the rest of the missing lot." They ransacked Eli's small shed and living quarters. It was a clear, ugly performance for the town. Eli stood by, his jaw clenched, his hands folded. He knew fighting back meant giving Mercer the excuse to beat him senseless. Behind a stack of coal sacks, Mercer's deputy found exactly what they were looking for, a large, sealed sack of new, unissued rail spikes, clearly marked with the railroad's inventory code, the same lot number that was reported missing the week before. It was a crude, obvious plant. "Lock him up," Mercer ordered. "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice quiet but intense, "that sack was not here yesterday." "I'm sure you believe that," Mercer sneered, "but the evidence speaks for itself." Just then, a small crowd started to gather, mostly the railroad hands. One man, Harlan, a sturdy black freedman who worked on the tracks and had served in a Union engineering regiment, stepped forward. "Sheriff," Harlan said respectfully, "Mr. Cutter was on duty with us the entire night the inventory went missing. He helped secure the explosives lockup, and we ate breakfast together at dawn. If these spikes were moved here, it wasn't by him." The other workers nodded their agreement, forming a small, quiet alliance of labor against corrupt authority. Mercer waved them away dismissively. "You all stick together. Get back to work before I arrest you for obstruction." Eli was taken into custody, leaving Nora to feel a crushing sense of defeat. They were fighting a ghost that knew their next move. The violence escalated that evening, targeting Nora directly. She was at the homestead, putting away her supplies, when she heard the unmistakable sound of breaking wood and the shouts of men. 3 of Brand's young ranch hands, fueled by bad whiskey and Brand's implied permission, were setting fire to the small, rickety shed Nora had planned to use as a coop for a few chickens and a shelter for 2 lambs she had purchased. Nora grabbed the nearest object, a rusty, decorative garden hoe, and ran out screaming. The men scattered, laughing, but the shed was fully ablaze. Eli, released late in the day on the judge's orders, Brand hadn't counted on Judge Doyle's diligence, had been walking back to the Avery place to check on Nora. He saw the plume of smoke rising against the darkening sky and started sprinting. He arrived as Nora was desperately trying to throw dirt on the flames, choking on the thick, acrid smoke. He didn't say a word. Eli sized up the situation instantly. The fire was close to the main cabin. He grabbed the full bucket of water from the well, the clean water she had worked so hard to secure, and threw it directly onto the most threatening corner of the blaze. He then used his own coat to smother the remaining flames in the center of the shed, beating the burning timbers down with a controlled fury. Nora, coughing violently, stumbled back from the heat. Eli caught her as she swayed, pulling her against his massive, soot-stained chest, carrying her away from the smoke. It was the first time they had been locked in a full embrace. Not a touch of shared labor, but a desperate collision of bodies. He held her tight, his hands supporting the back of her head as she gasped for clean air. "You're safe," he whispered fiercely, the sound muffled by her hair. When the immediate danger had passed, and the small fire was reduced to smoldering ruin, Nora straightened up, her face smeared with ash, her eyes wet from the smoke. "They will not stop," she said, her voice raw. "They won't," Eli agreed, his hand still resting protectively on her shoulder. Eli, his anger a cold, dangerous thing, wanted to ride out and find the men. He wanted to use the discipline of his hammer on their faces. "No," Nora stopped him, putting a hand on his arm, feeling the tense muscle beneath the rough fabric. Eli, we will not fight fire with violence. Brand wants us to fight in the dirt, to give him a reason to shoot or lock us away. We must win the right way, or there is nothing worth winning here. We use the law. She cleaned up the soot, her resolve firmer than ever. The following morning, she went straight to Judge Doyle and filed a formal complaint detailing the arson, the illegal water diversion citing the erased cap, and the obvious planting of evidence on Eli's property. She presented the crow's foot heel mark and Avery's map. "Judge Doyle," Nora insisted, her voice calm and compelling. "I request that you issue a writ to inspect the Avery well and the immediate vicinity for further evidence of foul play, and that you demand an inspection of the primary water valve. We have evidence of murder and conspiracy to steal vital resources. Brand cannot be above the law." Judge Doyle listened intently. Nora's rational legal appeal, backed by the physical evidence, finally tipped the scales. "I cannot issue a murder warrant based on a heel print," the judge stated. "But I can and will issue a decree for a formal, public inspection of the Avery well and the Brand water lines to verify the claim of theft and property damage. This is a matter of public health and safety now, not just a land dispute." She signed the paper with a firm hand. "The inspection will take place in exactly 48 hours. That gives Brand time to prepare and us time to make sure the entire town is watching." The clock had started ticking, leading them directly toward the inevitable showdown. In the midst of this increasing tension, the simple, necessary acts of labor provided a strange, stabilizing sanctuary. Nora continued sewing the wedding dress for the Navajo girl, focusing on the fine, hopeful stitches of a garment meant for a new beginning. Eli, meanwhile, was commissioned by a miner to create a simple, braided iron ring for his sweetheart, a rough, symbolic commitment in a world that valued practicality over sentiment. They rarely spoke of their own feelings. They only spoke of the evidence, the next step, and the work at hand. Yet, the town had noticed. The gossips whispered in the general store that Nora was only keeping the land to lure Eli, or that Eli was protecting Nora because she was the key to getting him revenge on Brand. The constant whispers were painful, but they endured them silently, bound by a shared knowledge they were fighting for something much larger than themselves, the right to honest, self-sufficient life in the territory. As Eli put the final coat of protective oil on the homestead's wellhead that evening, Nora walked out onto the porch. 48 hours, she said, looking toward the dark outline of the Brand ranch. "It's enough time for him to try to fill the well in again," Eli replied, his tone grim. Nora smiled faintly. "Then we'll just have to make sure he knows the whole town will be watching us dig." The air inside the small Avery cabin had finally settled, the metallic scent of smoke from the burnt shed replaced by the warm, sweet smell of pine and brewed coffee. It was a rare quiet evening, a lull between the violence of the fire and the impending clash at the well. Eli had been gone all day, setting up traps and tripwires around the property perimeter, a practical defense against further arson. Nora, her hands still faintly trembling from the adrenaline of the previous night, was sitting by the stove. She had taken down her hair, brushing out the red dust that clung to the tight braids. The soft light of the oil lamp caught the threads of silver in her otherwise dark hair, making her look older and somehow more vulnerable. Eli came in, shedding his heavy canvas coat near the door. The simple act of entering and closing the latch behind him seemed to bring a measurable drop in the surrounding tension. He moved to the small hearth, expertly poking the glowing embers, and placed the battered coffee pot back on the heat. "I only have black," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. "The kind that tastes like engine oil and regret." Nora smiled faintly. "I think I have enough regret of my own right now. Thank you, black will do." She poured a cup for each of them. As she sat down, she slowly pulled off the long sleeves of her house dress, which she usually wore rolled up, then immediately smoothed her hands over the skin, a habitual gesture of covering up. The lamplight revealed the area on her left wrist, not a severe scar, but a patch of thin, discolored skin from the childhood accident, a flaw she had carried with her, a physical manifestation of her deep-seated feeling of being merely practical, never beautiful. She stared into the dark surface of the coffee. "I know what they're saying in town," Nora murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "The gossips at Rosa's store, that I am just a plain seamstress trying to lure a strong man into keeping a parcel of land I don't deserve. They look at me and they see someone ordinary, someone who needs the land more than she deserves the man." She took a breath, the vulnerability pushing past her usual practical defenses. She confessed the quiet shame she always carried. "I am a useful woman. Eli, I can sew, I can teach, I can manage a ledger, but I am not beautiful." She finally lifted her gaze, letting him see the self-doubt reflected there. "I'm not the kind of woman a man like you, after everything you've seen, would choose just for herself." Eli set his mug down on the table with a soft, decisive clink. The sound resonated in the small cabin. He didn't offer a flowery denial or a casual dismissal. He walked slowly around the table. He stood over her. His large, calloused hands, the hands that shaped iron and steered trains, gently reached for her face. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a lingering smudge of ash near her ear. He leaned down, his eyes locked on hers, the firelight catching the fierce, steady truth in their steel-gray depths. "Then my eyes are liars." The statement was not a compliment. It was a simple, non-negotiable fact, a promise in 2 syllables. Eli wasn't praising a fleeting beauty. He was claiming the whole of her, the resilience, the honesty, the fight, and the small scar she tried to hide. He pulled her close, the rough wool of his shirt against her cheek, and held her pressed tightly against his solid chest. "You stood in the fire for 2 lambs," he murmured, his voice husky, close to her ear. "You stood against the man who runs this valley with nothing but a document and the truth. That is what I see. Nora, that is what holds a home together." The kiss that followed was not elegant or practiced. It was a collision of necessity and certainty, a meeting of 2 solitary people who had finally found their anchor. His lips were rough, tasting faintly of iron and coffee. His hand, that strong, rough hand, slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, guiding her, supporting her with absolute assurance. Nora clung to him, the long weeks of tension and fear dissolving into the simple warmth of his proximity. She felt the thick cord of muscle across his shoulder, the scar a silent testament to the pain he carried. She wasn't looking for soft words. She was looking for a sure foundation. And she found it in the sturdy, unmoving presence of Eli Cutter. They drew apart slightly, Nora resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the solid, trustworthy rhythm of his heart. The shared space in the cabin suddenly felt vast, holding the weight of their unspoken feelings. Eli put his hand back on her shoulder and gently pulled away, maintaining a slight, respectful distance. He was asking permission without saying a word, declaring that his desire would not override her comfort or choice. He was a man of action, but his strongest action was always respect. Nora looked up at him, a warmth blossoming in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She nodded once, a clear, definite consent. "Tonight," she whispered, "I want to be safe. Eli?" They shared the narrow bed that night, seeking not passion but closeness, warmth, and the absolute security of knowing the other person was awake, present, and willing to defend them. They chose proximity and gentle assurance over physical abandon, a true intimacy in the world that offered them little else. They were a safe harbor for each other, 2 wounded people finding rest in the silent presence of shared strength. As the hours drifted by, Nora felt the deep, steady breathing of the man beside her, a calm that chased away her own anxious insomnia. In the quiet, she reached into her sewing kit, pulling out a small square of white cotton handkerchief. She had embroidered a simple, neat E in red thread in the corner. She pressed it into Eli's hand. "For you," she said softly, "to wipe the dust or perhaps the oil, and to remind you that your name is worthy of respect, no matter what Mercer says. Eli's fingers closed around the soft fabric. He reached under his pillow and produced a small, twisted piece of iron. It was a track spike he had forged, one of his marked pieces, but he had bent and polished it into a rough, small loop. "It's not silver," he said, his voice gruff, embarrassed by the vulnerability of the gesture. "But it's mine. It held the rail. You wear it, Nora, and when this is over, when Brand is gone, I will make you a proper silver one. Until then, this is a promise." Nora took the small, heavy iron ring, feeling the distinct, faint imprint of the E.C. mark on the underside. She carefully threaded a strand of red embroidery floss through it, tying it securely to her own thin necklace. "I will wear it," she confirmed, "and I will keep you." The emotional stakes of their fight against Brand had suddenly soared. He was no longer just attempting to steal land and water. He was threatening the most precious thing they had just found, their nascent, quiet love. Brand's power threatened the very possibility of their shared future. Nora poured herself another cup of coffee. The dark, bitter brew was just what she needed. "It is like medicine," she remarked, taking a thoughtful sip. Eli, watching her, let a small, dry chuckle escape his lips. "It is, and you know why I drink it black, like that." "Because you're a hard man, Mr. Eli." "Because you are the sugar," he replied, a flash of genuine wit finally breaking through his armor. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Nora felt her heart swell, and she laughed a warm, rich sound in the small cabin. Their moment of peace was shattered just before dawn. A distant sound of hooves, not the steady rhythm of a man riding home, but the slow, cautious pace of someone watching. Eli was instantly alert. He stood up silently and moved to the small, newly covered window, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, which lay on the shelf. "It's just outside the property line," Eli muttered. "Someone checking the perimeter." The realization was a punch in the gut. Brand knew they were a threat, and now they were being monitored. The calm had been earned, but the danger was imminent. "We have to win the inspection," Nora asserted, her eyes now burning with a new fire. "Not just to keep the land, but to get the license." "License?" Eli asked. "Once we've established legal residency and cleared the matter of Thomas Avery's death, I will apply for a marriage license," Nora declared, her voice firm. "This land will have a clear, legal owner, Mr. Eli, and I intend for that owner to be you and me." Eli turned from the window, his intense gaze falling on her. He nodded, a solemn, silent acceptance of the challenge. The stakes were no longer a homestead, they were a lifetime. The 48 hours leading up to the well inspection were a crucible of escalating pressure. Silas Brand was determined to force Nora and Eli out before Judge Doyle could formalize the inquiry. The latest blow struck Eli's professional standing. A freight car, loaded with expensive rail parts, caught fire near the switching yard. The blaze was deliberate, confined to the end of the line, far from the main depot, but close enough to Eli's forge to make him an easy target. Sheriff Mercer, riding hard, arrived as the town was gathering to fight the flames. He didn't hesitate. Cutter Mercer bellowed over the roar of the fire. "You're responsible for guarding the materials. You allowed the fire to start to cover up your theft." Eli, who had rushed to the scene to help contain the fire, was immediately detained. "I was at the homestead. Mercer, check your patrol logs." "Logs can be faked. Cutter, the fire is too close to your shop. You'll be spending the night in the lockup while we investigate." Nora, who had arrived with a bucket, watched helplessly as Eli was marched away. The intent was clear: isolate Nora and stop Eli from being present at the inspection. While Eli was unjustly held, Nora spent the dark hours racing back and forth between the jail and her allies. She found Harlan and the rest of the rail crew. They confirmed Eli's alibi: he had been miles away. And the freight car was only lightly guarded by a man known to frequent Brand's ranch. "Brand is trying to break him. "Miss Quinn," Harlan said, his face etched with worry. "We all know it, but Eli doesn't scare easy. He just needs an honest account of his movements." The harsh landscape seemed to conspire with Brand. The drought, already severe, reached a desperate peak. The Pecos was barely a trickle, and the dust was so pervasive it felt like the world was actively trying to choke itself. Brand's next move was a brutal display of arrogance. His drovers, led by a man Nora recognized from the fire, intentionally drove a massive herd of Brand's cattle across the river and onto the small, fragile stream that fed the Avery land. The desperate, thirsty animals trampled the banks and fouled the remaining water. Nora, alone at the homestead, grabbed the only firearm she owned, a rusty, single-shot shotgun left behind by Thomas Avery. She loaded it, her hands trembling, and walked down to the water's edge. She stood squarely in front of the cattle, facing the drovers. "Get your animals off this land," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady, though the gun felt impossibly heavy. "This water is reserved for inspection under Judge Doyle's writ." The drover laughed, a coarse, dismissive sound. "You gonna shoot a cow? Miss Quinn, the sheriff won't like that." "I won't shoot a cow," Nora replied, leveling the gun not at the men, but at the ground between her feet. "But this land is under legal claim. You cross this line, and you violate a court order. I will not fire unless my life is threatened, but I will not move. You can have the water, but you'll have to do it by breaking the law in front of a witness. And I promise you, I will make sure Judge Doyle hears every word." The drovers hesitated. They were hired thugs, not murderers. Nora's calm adherence to the letter of the law, even when holding a shotgun, paralyzed them. They eventually whistled the herd away, leaving the stream bank muddy and the water polluted. But the boundary held. Nora had won the confrontation without firing a shot, proving that legal resolve could be a sharper weapon than brute force. Meanwhile, the town was splitting. Many residents, terrified of losing access to water or being targeted by Brand's men, shrank back, but the community that relied on honest work, the miners, the rail workers, Rosa Alvarez, and the growing Mexicano population began to rally, signing a petition demanding a fair investigation into the water rights, seeing Nora's fight as their own. That night, the weather turned violently dramatic. A severe electrical storm erupted over the high mesa. Lightning exploded on the plains, and the high-tension signal wires used for the railroad began to burn and snap. Eli, released late from jail due to Judge Doyle's intervention, arrived at the rail yard just as a freight train, overloaded with mining ore, was approaching a curve where the rail ties had warped from the heat and the signaling system was dead. Eli didn't hesitate. He grabbed the section boss and two of his best men. Using his intimate knowledge of the track and the tools of his trade, Eli risked electrocution. Climbing up the burning trackside, he supervised the rapid, skilled cutting of a temporary rail diversion, forcing the heavy train onto a spur and saving it from a catastrophic derailment on the main curve. It was a spectacular public display of his professionalism and loyalty to the community's infrastructure. Eli Cutter, the accused thief, had just saved a crucial train. The following morning, Brand played his final social card. He orchestrated a visit from Pastor O'Leary, a well-meaning but naive clergyman, to Nora's cabin. "Miss Quinn," the pastor said, clearly uncomfortable, "Mr. Brand is concerned about your reputation. He suggests that by pursuing this land claim, you are drawing undue attention to yourself and Eli Cutter. A man with a troubled past, he feels you should accept a modest sum and leave, thereby preserving your good name." Nora sat him down, offering him coffee. "Pastor, I appreciate your concern for my good name. But how can my name be good if it is built on a lie and sustained by cowardice, Mr. Avery? A man who offered me a home was likely murdered for this water. Mr. Cutter, a good man, is being framed by the man who owns the church pew you sit in. We cannot buy our reputation by ceding justice. We win by standing for the truth. And truth, pastor, is light." The pastor left, visibly shaken, his moral compass struggling to align itself against Brand's financial gravity. The stress on Eli was visible. He was constantly moving, hyper-vigilant, carrying the weight of his past. The war had taught him that violence was the only language some men understood, but Nora insisted on a different path. One moment, Eli admitted his inner conflict. "I feel like I'm fighting with one hand tied. Nora, I want to take a whip to those men who burned your shed. I want to face Brand in the street and settle it the old way. I keep expecting the machine gun fire to start." Nora simply took his scarred hand, squeezing it. "We win with light. Eli, your strength is not the violence you know, but the quiet, honest labor you chose. That is what will stand up in court. That is what will stand up in this town." In a moment of profound, simple grace that evening, Nora was summoned by Rosa Alvarez. A young Apache woman, separated from her family, was going into a difficult labor in Rosa's back room. Nora, having served as a practical teacher in Missouri, was pressed into service to assist. The air was heavy, the labor painful. Rosa needed a sharp, sterile edge to cut the umbilical cord. Eli, waiting outside to guard the general store, quickly heated his smallest, cleanest forging knife in the coal fire, sterilizing the blade until it glowed red hot. Nora took the knife, still radiating heat, and used it to bring a new life safely into the world, a knife forged for violence, now purified for mercy. The real, immediate work of life, birth and practical compassion, was a powerful counter to the looming threat of the drought and Brand's cruelty. The day of the well inspection arrived. The drought had peaked, turning the valley into a tinderbox. The heat was oppressive, and the 10-day water limit on the Avery property had expired. The showdown was now or never. But Brand struck first, a final, spiteful, preemptive move. Just before sunrise, Sheriff Mercer rode out to the Avery homestead. He carried a crude, handwritten order, signed by himself, citing public safety. Eli and Nora watched from the porch as Mercer illegally nailed a metal sheet across the top of the freshly repaired well, officially sealing it and locking them out of their own water source. "No access to the water until the hearing is complete, Miss Quinn," Mercer announced, his face smug. "And since the well is sealed, I suggest you don't even show up for the inspection. You have no water, therefore you have no claim." Eli started forward, a primal fury rising in his eyes. Nora stopped him with a firm hand on his arm. "Save it, Eli," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the metal plate. "Let him have his foolish last victory. We are not fighting for water today. We are fighting for the truth." They left the sealed well and rode into town, ready to face the crowd and Silas Brand at Judge Doyle's court. The tension was at its breaking point. The sun beat down relentlessly on the Avery homestead. Despite the heat, the property was crowded. The inspection, decreed by Judge Maeve Doyle, had become the centerpiece of Santa Rosa's social and legal life. Dozens of citizens, railroad workers, miners, Rosa Alvarez and her family, and even curious ranch hands gathered around the newly sealed well. Judge Doyle, wearing a simple but imposing dark suit, presided from a folding chair, her presence injecting a rare dose of stability into the wild territory. Silas Brand stood opposite, flanked by Sheriff Wade Mercer, both radiating arrogant certainty. Brand was confident that Nora Quinn, having no key to the well and no formal title, would fail to present substantial evidence. Nora and Eli stood together, a quiet bastion of resolve. Judge Doyle cleared her throat. "Miss Quinn, you have requested this inspection based on a claim of illegal water diversion and potential foul play regarding the death of Thomas Avery. The floor is yours." Nora stepped forward, holding the small bundle of her evidence. She spoke not with passion, but with the cool clarity of a teacher presenting facts. "Your Honor, this dispute is not about a land deed. It is about the right to water and the right to life. Mr. Brand claimed Mr. Avery's property based on unpaid water fees. Yet the man died in his own well just after attempting to pay those fees. We believe Mr. Avery was murdered for his water rights." She presented the evidence in a steady stream. "First, we submit Thomas Avery's hand-drawn water map, detailing the true underground feeder lines on his property. This map shows that Avery's water came directly from the Pecos before it reached Brand's main ditch. She handed the oilskin to the judge. Second, we present this, Nora continued, holding up the small, worn heel piece found near the well lip. This heel contains a custom-forged metal stud pattern known as the crow's foot. Specific to Brand's ranch hands, this suggests a physical altercation, a struggle right before Mr. Avery fell. Mercer scoffed loudly. A piece of old trash found in the dirt. Anyone could have dropped that. Perhaps, Nora conceded, turning to address Mercer directly. But this connects to our third piece of evidence. The illegal water diversion found near the abandoned rail depot which siphons the Avery water to Brand's ranch was secured with a valve cap that had been filed down to remove the original maker's mark. E.C. Mercer started to move forward, but Judge Doyle's sharp gaze held him back. This was Eli's moment. He stepped forward, his massive frame radiating quiet authority. For a man who spoke in monosyllables, his voice was surprisingly articulate and calm. Your Honor, I made that valve cap. I made all of them 2 years ago for the railroad. The mark, C, is on the face and the underside. Filing that soft cast iron leaves a distinct pattern of scratches, a kind of metallurgical fingerprint, which can only be matched by the tools used to file it. Whoever filed that cap knew my work, used my work to steal water, and then attempted to destroy the evidence to frame me. Eli paused, then added the simple, unvarnished truth. A thief uses his own tools, a framer uses someone else's. Nora continued, bringing forward the community witnesses. Harlan, the rail foreman, testified that Eli was nowhere near the burning freight car and detailed Eli's heroic actions saving the ore train during the electrical storm. Rosa Alvarez testified to seeing Sheriff Mercer near the stolen goods shed the night before the spikes were discovered at Eli's smithy. Mercer, desperate, drew a wrinkled piece of paper from his pocket. Your Honor, this is irrelevant speculation. I have a secondary warrant to seize evidence from Nora Quinn's current residence items related to the theft of the rail spikes. He was gambling that the planted evidence would finally ruin their credibility. You won't find anything, Sheriff, Nora said calmly, because Mr. Cutter and I aren't foolish enough to keep stolen goods in the house we're fighting to keep. You've been looking for that sack for days. Just as Mercer began to bellow his intent to search, Jesse Pike, the newsboy, pushed through the crowd. He clutched a small box camera, a recent gift from a railroad engineer. Wait, Jesse cried out, presenting a wet, slightly warped photographic plate. Mr. Mercer asked me to deliver a package to the warehouse the night before. I took a picture of him because he asked me not to tell anyone I saw him. The image, though crude, was unmistakable. It showed Sheriff Mercer, in the dead of night, carrying a heavy, clearly labeled sack the missing rail spikes behind the railroad storage area, the very spot where he had claimed to have discovered them later at Eli's shop. Brand, until now silent, let out a noise of frustrated fury. He had relied on his nephew's clumsy execution. This is an outrage. This woman is inventing evidence. The pipe is a lie. Where is the water anyway? You sealed the well yourself, Mercer Brand shouted, momentarily forgetting his control. The water runs straight to the river. Not my ranch. You can't prove the diversion. Actually, Mr. Brand, we can, Nora countered, stepping in quickly to capitalize on his slip. Your Honor, Mr. Brand just admitted that the well has been sealed. I request that the seal, which the sheriff placed illegally under his own authority, be removed so we can examine the water source. Judge Doyle, seeing the community support, the framed evidence, and Brand's blatant manipulation, struck her gavel decisively. Sheriff Mercer, remove that seal immediately. We will inspect the well and the water flow. Mercer hesitated, sweat pouring down his neck. Brand shot him a look that promised professional ruin. But the workers in the crowd began to chant quietly. Then louder, "Open the well, open the well." Mercer, knowing he was outnumbered by the sheer force of public opinion, slowly unfastened the metal sheeting, When the well cap was removed, the hole was deep, dark, and still. Eli took the oilskin map and pointed to the spot on the north rim. The pipe is connected here. Eli dropped a brightly colored fishing lure into the water. It sank down, caught, then disappeared with a distinct thunk against the stone lining. Then, the water level in the well began to drop slightly, moving against the internal pressure of the pipe. Judge Doyle gave the order. A crew of miners, eager to stand against Brand, quickly dug a short trench exactly where Avery's map indicated. They uncovered a small, secondary pipe, a concealed gravity line connected directly to the well's source. Eli used his custom wrench to break the seal. When the connection was broken, the water that was being secretly diverted under the ground suddenly erupted from the pipe's severance point. It shot out in a powerful, undeniable stream, flowing not toward the Pecos, but in a clear, visible channel leading directly toward the boundary of the Brand Ranch. The crowd gasped. The truth was pouring out onto the desert floor. Brand's conspiracy was exposed. He wasn't simply claiming the land for debt. He had been systematically murdering the water source and using it to enrich himself, starving the town and framing an innocent man. Brand's eyes went wild with cornered rage. This is a farce. I won't stand for this. Two of Brand's armed ranch hands, who had been lingering near the crowd's edge, suddenly drew their revolvers. They fired a warning shot into the air, causing pandemonium. "Stop them!" Brand screamed, pointing at Nora. "Seize the map!" Eli reacted instantly, shoving Nora to the ground and turning his body toward the threat. The shots rang out. One bullet grazed Eli's shoulder, tearing through the fabric and drawing blood before slamming harmlessly into the wooden post of the porch. The violence was the final straw. Harlan and the railroad workers, already furious over Eli's false arrest, surged forward, joining the local miners and Rosa's strong sons. The small army of laboring men swarmed Brand's gunmen, knocking the weapons from their hands and wrestling them into the dust. Sheriff Mercer, seeing his uncle's empire collapsing and his own part in the conspiracy laid bare, tried to flee, but Judge Doyle stood up, her hand pointing directly at him. "Sheriff Mercer, you are under arrest for conspiracy, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice." Mercer was quickly apprehended and restrained. Silas Brand, his face pale with fury, watched his power crumble around him. Judge Doyle struck her gavel one last time, delivering the verdict of the inspection. Based on the overwhelming evidence of illegal water diversion, conspiracy, and the physical evidence tying Brand's associates to the suspicious death of Thomas Avery, I hereby issue an immediate temporary injunction. Mr. Brand's water rights are provisionally seized. I am establishing a provisional water committee of 5 trusted neutral town residents, including Miss Nora Quinn and Mr. Harlan, to manage the equitable distribution of water immediately. The case for Thomas Avery's death was reopened. The initial investigation strongly suggested Avery had been pushed after refusing to sign away his water rights, a crime now pinned squarely on Brand and his men. The true, terrifying scale of Brand's ambition had been revealed. In the aftermath, away from the chaos and arrests, Nora knelt beside Eli on the porch. The grazing shot had been superficial, the bullet passing cleanly through the meat of his shoulder. But the dark, wet stain was spreading fast. Nora, the practical seamstress, took a piece of clean cloth from her skirt and pressed it firmly against his wound. Eli winced, but his eyes were fixed on her. "You took the shot for me," Nora whispered, her own hands shaking as she tended the wound. Eli leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. Ignoring the pain, he did not talk about the bullet or the bravery. He talked about their future. "We're alive," Eli murmured, his steel-gray eyes finding hers. "And since we're both still breathing, we're still getting married." The fallout from the public inspection was swift and decisive. The temporary injunction held, and Sheriff Mercer's confession, given quickly in a desperate bid for leniency, sealed Silas Brand's fate. An organized search of the Brand Ranch headquarters revealed a hidden ledger detailing years of bribery. illegal land swaps, and the manipulation of water permits. Mercer admitted Brand had paid him to plant the spikes and to ignore the crow's foot heel print found near Avery's well. With Brand jailed and awaiting extradition to the territorial capital for trial on charges including conspiracy and accessory to murder, the atmosphere in Santa Rosa eased, though it remained wary. The newly formed Water Committee, consisting of Nora, Harlan, Judge Doyle, Rosa Alvarez's son, and a local miner, immediately set about establishing an equitable distribution schedule. The priority was given to the small farms, schools, and homesteads, the very people Brand had starved. For the first time in years, the flow of the Pecos felt communal, not controlled. At the Avery homestead, life returned to a routine of healing and building. Eli Cutter, after a quick visit to Rosa for 6 precise stitches in his shoulder, returned to the forge. "You need to rest that arm. Mr. Eli," Nora scolded him one afternoon, finding him already blowing the bellows. The heavy, rhythmic work sent sharp jolts of pain through his freshly mended shoulder. "I need 2 hands to forge a true wedding ring." "Nora," he replied, not looking up, his voice grumbling with stubborn effort. He was pressing the metal, working the bellows carefully with his left arm. "And you need 2 hands to wash the dishes," Nora retorted with mock severity, adopting his own dry wit. "So perhaps you should save your strength for the less heroic work tonight." Eli stopped, letting the heavy hammer rest on the anvil. A small, rare smile touched his lips. "Forging a ring requires 2 strong hands. Washing the dishes requires 2 hands and a strong stomach. Considering your burnt cornbread, I'll settle for the ring first." Their exchanges were now infused with this simple, teasing humor, a domestic counterpoint to the danger they had faced. Later that evening, the homestead looked closer to a home than ever before. Eli had finished bracing the porch and was now sitting on the edge of it, carving a complex pattern into a piece of scrap wood. Nora walked over, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "It's safe now," Nora said. Sitting beside him, "The title will be settled in a few weeks, transferring from Thomas Avery's estate directly to the township, which will then sell it to me for a fair price. Now that the lien is cleared, we have our home." Eli nodded, his hands still. He pulled something from his pocket. It wasn't the small, twisted rail spike he'd given her before. This time, it was a perfectly crafted ring. It was still iron, symbolic of his work and enduring strength, but it was braided with thin strands of silver, representing the resilience and dignity Nora had brought to the marriage. He turned to face her, dropping to one knee in the dust. The gesture was awkward and profoundly genuine. Eli Cutter, the man who struggled with words more than he struggled with fire, cleared his throat. He didn't offer a grand speech. He offered a permanent truth. "This is mine," Eli said, holding out the ring. "It's stronger than gold. And you are the strongest woman I have ever known. Nora Quinn." He looked her directly in the eyes. "Stay here with me. Be my home." Nora's eyes filled not with tears of sorrow, but of acceptance. She reached up and placed her hand over his rough, scarred palm engulfing her smaller, needle-pricked one. "I was always going to stay." "Eli," she whispered, "but I will stay with you." "Yes." She took the ring. She pulled the thin red embroidery floss from the chain around her neck, unwound it from the temporary spike ring, and tied the small, bright thread to the new iron and silver band. She slipped the ring onto her finger. The red thread, a symbol of her perseverance and domestic art, was now tied to the ring of his steadfast labor. "We'll build a bigger porch," Nora promised, sealing the proposal with a practical, hopeful commitment. "Big enough for the schoolroom and for your anvil when you're not using it. A porch that welcomes people in, not keeps them out." A few days later, they were married. The wedding was the epitome of simplicity and sincerity, held in the sun-dappled yard behind Rosa Alvarez's general store. There was no grand church, just the warm scent of baked cornbread and strong coffee. Harlan played a few simple, joyful tunes on his banjo. Judge Doyle, in her official capacity, presided over the vows, her wise eyes twinkling. Their promise was brief, honest, and utterly without fanfare. The kiss they exchanged was sufficient a meeting of certainty, witnessed by the small community they had helped to save. The quiet good graces of the community followed. People who had been too afraid to support them openly now came forward. A miner contributed a few planks of quality pine for the schoolroom. Rosa gave Nora a bucket of heirloom seeds for the garden. The rail workers pitched in a few hens for the coop. Slowly, piece by piece, an accumulation of kindness pushed back the long shadow of Brand's malice. Eli, ever the practical symbolist, welded a small, heavy iron bell and hung it near the Avery wellhead, replacing the sheriff's oppressive seal. The bell, meant for the water committee, would ring with a clear, resonant tone every time the water was officially diverted for the small farms, a triumphant sound of shared resource and public accountability. In a private moment of closure, Nora rode out to the remote spot where Thomas Avery was buried. She placed a small bouquet of purple desert sage and yellow wildflowers on his grave. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, the dust motes dancing around her. "You offered me a home, and because of your fight, I found a foundation. Rest well." It was a quiet farewell to the past and a turning toward the future. Meanwhile, Eli found an old, faded letter from his Civil War days, a communication that detailed a particularly bloody action. He had carried it with him, a constant, heavy reminder of the man he used to be. He walked to the edge of the property and lit a match, watching the dried paper turn to ash in the evening breeze. The old guilt and the weight of the cannon fire finally drifted away, leaving his shoulders lighter. As the sun sank, painting the dusty Santa Rosa sky in shades of deep orange and violet, they sat together on their new porch, their hands clasped. The air was calm, the intense red dust finally settling, granting the town a fragile peace. The only sound was the low, persistent song of the desert crickets. It was an earned peace, not a given one. Nora looked down at the iron and silver ring on her finger, bound with the red thread, and then at the strong, quiet man beside her. The piece felt solid, built on the strength of Eli's iron and the durability of her thread. The peace that settled over Santa Rosa was shallow. The kind that follows a brush fire, everything essential survived, but the ashes still held heat. Brand's power was gone, but his residue remained. Among the ranch hands arrested after the clash at the well, one man, Quill, managed to evade Mercer's crumbling authority and disappear into the canyons. Quill had been one of the drovers who had tried to trash the Avery stream, a bitter man loyal only to the paycheck Brand provided. Now, seeing Brand led away and his own future looking bleak, Quill decided on a final, destructive act. Late one night, under the cover of the first dark, heavy rain of the season, Quill put his plan into action. He was heading for the territorial border, and he intended to carry a massive, vengeful farewell with him. He planned to blow out a section of the old earth dam that funneled river water into the main irrigation ditch, not Brand's ditch, but the town's, now managed by the water committee. If the dam broke under the pressure of the sudden rainfall, the torrent would not only deprive the small farms of their lifeline, but would funnel a flash flood directly down the low-lying center of Santa Rosa, washing away the saloon, Rosa's store, the rail yard, and half the homes. The first hint of trouble was the roar. It wasn't the steady, familiar sound of the desert rain. It was a hungry, gathering sound, the voice of massive water moving too fast. Eli, always tuned to the landscape, woke instantly. He and Nora rushed out onto the porch. The steady drumming of the rain was punctuated by the terrifying, deep rumble of the Pecos being violently disturbed. "That's not the river," Eli muttered, pulling on his boots. "That's the dam. It's breaking." "But the water committee checked it last week," Nora shouted over the downpour. "They checked the gates, not the foundation. Brand was using that dam as his choke point. Someone is finishing the job." They rode out into the furious, soaking rain, Eli pushing the horse to its limit along the muddy track toward the low-lying dam structure. They arrived to find a scene of chaotic destruction. Quill, soaked to the bone, was desperately trying to dig away a weakened section of the earthworks, hoping to widen a breach that the rain was already tearing open. He had a shovel and a single, desperate stick of dynamite, which he was too panicked to safely ignite. The water was already surging over the lip, tearing chunks of clay and rock away. If the breach expanded by another yard, the entire structure would fail within minutes. Eli immediately understood the dilemma. Quill was trapped in the muddy sluice, too close to the rapidly collapsing wall of the dam to escape. If Eli focused on stopping Quill, the dam would break, destroying the town. If he focused on repairing the dam, Quill would be washed away, a just punishment for his actions, but still a man's life. Eli, the man who had struggled so fiercely with his own capacity for violence, did not hesitate. The memory of Nora's hand on his, her constant refrain of winning with light, anchored him. "Nora!" the rope Eli yelled, jumping off his horse and running toward the dam's edge. He grabbed a heavy section of timber left behind by the committee and scrambled down into the muddy bank near the breach. He worked against the fierce current, trying to wedge the timber into the gap to slow the erosion. The water was waist-deep, cold, and immensely powerful. Quill, seeing Eli struggling nearby, stopped digging, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He could have run, but he was trapped by the collapsing earth. "Help me, you fool!" Eli roared. Not at Quill, but at the water, fighting the massive flow. Nora, standing on the high bank, quickly tied a length of lasso rope which Eli always carried around a sturdy mesquite tree. She scrambled to the edge and flung the other end down towards the two men. "Quill!" "Take the line now," Nora commanded. Quill stared at the line, then at Eli, who was now ankle-deep in the crumbling dam wall, risking his life not for revenge, but for the town. Quill finally dropped his shovel, grabbing the rope and letting Nora haul him out of the immediate danger zone, onto the muddy bank. Seconds before a large section of the dam gave way with a sickening thud, Eli threw himself out of the way, scrambling to the higher ground, soaked and exhausted, but alive. The large timber he had jammed in place held, redirecting the main surge of water and keeping the dam from total failure. Quill lay on the ground, shivering, defeated not by an army or a bullet, but by an act of mercy he didn't deserve. "Why," Quill mumbled, coughing up river water, "why didn't you let the flood take me? I was the one." Eli simply stood over him, breathing heavily. Nora knelt down, not to judge, but to cover the man with a spare blanket she had carried. "We don't win by letting others drown, Quill," Nora said, her voice soft but firm. "We win by fixing what you break." Broken and humiliated, Quill finally confessed. He provided the final, damning details to Nora, and Eli Brand had ordered the initial push of Thomas Avery into the well, and Mercer had covered the details, ensuring the death looked accidental. Quill's confession was a complete, final nail in Brand's legal coffin. This was the true, moral climax of their story. Eli, the man scarred by war, chose human kindness over justifiable vengeance. Nora, the victim of Brand's bullying, chose law and rehabilitation over simple retribution. The community, arriving in small groups, witnessed the moment the man who tried to destroy them, saved by the very people he wronged. The act of mercy, in the face of absolute threat, changed the town's opinion of Nora and Eli forever, cementing their place as the moral center of Santa Rosa. With Quill's confession, the legal matters were swiftly concluded. Brand was successfully extradited and faced a full trial. Mercer, his confession already on record, received a long prison sentence. Quill, given his cooperation and the sheer scale of the community's forgiveness, was assigned 6 months of public service, supervised by Harlan to repair the dam and rebuild the ditches he had tried to destroy. Justice was served, not through execution, but through accountability and reconstruction. With the major conflict settled, their attention turned to the domestic bliss they had earned. Their adult love, built on shared danger and mutual respect, was settling into the real, messy work of daily life. This included their first serious disagreement. "The porch is perfect for the school." "Eli," Nora argued one morning over a burnt piece of toast. "It gets the morning light, and it's right by the well. But we need to add a small, enclosed room on the south side for the sewing equipment. And I need to build a larger, enclosed space for the forge," Eli countered, slightly annoyed. "The rail contract is growing. I need room for 2 apprentices, and I need the noise contained. That takes up the entire south side of the property. We agreed I'd build my shop first." "You need room for apprentices," Nora replied. Standing her ground, "I need room for children. If they don't have a school, they'll just become Brand's new ranch hands." The argument was sharp but short. They weren't fighting about emotion. They were fighting about space and priority, the real struggles of building a life. Eli stared at her stubborn expression, realized he was being difficult, and simply sighed, running a tired hand over his face. "I'm sorry, Nora. It's the habit of taking the whole field. I'll make the first building a double. One side for the small children, one side for the heavy metal. We'll teach them both, side by side. A school of hard knocks." "Then," Nora teased, but she moved quickly to hug him, apologizing instantly for her own impatience. They had learned to apologize quickly, their bond too precious to allow small frictions to linger, to commemorate their dual purpose. Eli began the new, joyous work of forging a school bell, a clear, resonant instrument that would call the children to learning. Nora, meanwhile, created a beautiful embroidered linen banner. She hung it in the cabin as a crystallization of their philosophy, water and word they nourished the town. Their repartee remained dry and affectionate. Eli would often complain that Nora was too loud in the mornings, tapping her needle on the thimble. "I'm forging silence, Eli," she would reply. One day, as Eli was testing the new school bell, its pure, clear tone ringing across the dusty property, Nora walked out. "That's a beautiful sound, Mr. Cutter," she said, sipping her coffee. Eli pulled her close, his arms strong despite the lingering pain in his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. "I forged that bell," he whispered, his voice warm and deep, "so I can hear your children call you home to dinner." The rapid action and the emotional stress had given way to a warm, sustained calm. The railroad, seeing the new stability and equitable water access, announced plans to open a dedicated freight station in Santa Rosa, promising long-term economic hope. The town, thanks to Nora's legal fight and Eli's ethical choice, was finally on the path to becoming a true, resilient community. The light of hope was not blindingly bright, but it was durable. The Sunday morning sun in Santa Rosa was not scorching, but gentle, diffused by the lingering moisture of the recent rain, which had successfully broken the long drought. The first sound to carry across the Avery homestead was the clear, commanding chime of the new school bell. Eli had finished forging it last week, and its resonant tone was now the voice of their new purpose. Nora stood on the wide, newly built porch, ringing the bell. She was teaching her first official class. The schoolroom, a sturdy, bright addition to the cabin, was filled with a mix of children, the sons of Harlan and the rail workers, the daughters of Rosa Alvarez, and a few shy Mexicano children whose families had been hesitant to venture into the American sector. Nora taught the letters and numbers written on a small slate, then quickly transitioned to practical skills. She taught the girls simple stitches and the importance of a straight seam, using the canvas-wrapped sewing machine that had survived the dust storm and the fire. She taught the boys how to mend a trouser and the value of a knot that held fast. She was teaching them not just literacy, but resilience. Eli, meanwhile, was not in his forge. He was across the stream, helping an elderly neighbor adjust his worn irrigation chute, a gesture of community goodwill that had become common since the water committee took charge. Eli had traded the violence of the hammer for the quiet service of his craft. He knew that the fight for water was ongoing, but now it was a matter of shared maintenance. not private greed. The school bell rang again, signaling the midday break. Nora emerged, her face alight with the day's exertion, gathering her books. Eli returned shortly, covered in river mud and smelling faintly of wet earth. He washed his hands thoroughly at the well, the small bell Eli had welded for the water committee chiming faintly as he worked the pump. They sat down for a small, shared lunch at the wooden table on the porch. The menu was simple stewed beans and cornbread. Nora placed the cornbread down. It was almost perfect this time, but one corner had caught the flame. "I managed to save most of it," Nora said, tapping the slightly blackened edge. Eli picked up the darker piece, examining it with mock seriousness. He took a large bite, chewing slowly. "It's good," he affirmed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's still burnt," Nora insisted, trying to elicit a more complex response. "Then it's still flavorful," Eli countered. "It's honest, Nora. It's exactly what it is." They exchanged a look that contained volumes, a shared understanding of the honest, imperfect struggle of their lives. The easy banter about the cornbread had become their shorthand for navigating everything else. The central message of their long, hard journey was now etched into the very fabric of Santa Rosa. Justice was not a savage act of vengeance. It was the slow, difficult process of establishing fair rules. Labor, honestly and kindly performed every day, whether with a needle or a hammer, possessed the true power to soften the harshness of the desert and the bitterness in people's hearts. They had sought to punish Silas Brand, but they had ended up healing the town. The side effects of their victory were the final closure of the town's prejudice, social friction. Irish immigrants, Mexicano families, black freedmen began to fade as they were united by the simple, non-negotiable need for water. Social barriers crumbled before the courage of two people who insisted on the truth. Their own mature love was not fiery, but solid, founded on respect, mutual accountability, asking permission, and a shared schedule for fixing the leaky faucet and planning the next school term. The conflicts that had haunted them were finally resolved. Nora's internal shame about her scar and her perceived plainness had been named and healed by Eli's fierce, unwavering acceptance. Eli's war trauma and fear of falling back into brute violence had been tamed and channeled by Nora's insistence on the law and the light. The social conflict over water was tamed by the establishment of the water committee. Even the nature itself, from drought to destructive flood, had been mitigated by their collective, timely action at the dam. The symbols they had forged along the way stood as lasting monuments. The iron and silver wedding ring, durable and refined, was Nora's daily reminder of their hard-won life. The school bell and the water committee bell were the sound of community voice and shared resource. The sewing frame and the blacksmith's hammer lay near each other on the porch, two halves of a whole their home. The final tone was one of quiet optimism. They were realists. They knew the desert was hard, money would be scarce, and Brand's influence might linger in small, spiteful ways, but faith had found its sturdy foothold. The pacing slowed, allowing the reader to breathe in the hard-earned tranquility. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the red dust in hues of rose and gold, the evening air grew cool. Nora walked down to the small, rilling irrigation ditch Eli had helped extend. The water trickled past the newly planted rows of corn, a symbol of life sustained. She looked at her wrist, the faded burn scar exposed to the cooling air. She no longer tried to hide it. Eli came up behind her, placing his hands lightly on her shoulders, his presence grounding. He saw her gaze fixed on the scar. He didn't comment on the past. He simply touched the flawed skin gently with his thumb. "Beauty," Eli murmured, his voice soft, close to her ear, "is the quiet kindness you put into the world every day. It's what we cultivate." "Nora," she leaned back against his solid strength, looking out at the vast, changing New Mexico sky. The dust, the red dust that clung to everything, had been part of their journey, a metaphor for the flaws and challenges they both carried. The final, Lasting truth was clear. Everyone carried their own red dust, their own flaws, their own painful history. The trick was finding the person who wasn't afraid to wipe the dust away with you rather than using it to build a cage. The end. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Tales channel, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.